People have always wondered how I've been able to live in such an isolated place. It mostly consists of dense forests and marshlands sprouting up around a vast lake that's considered a local beauty spot. The truth is, I've always preferred how isolated it is from the rest of the world and surrounding tranquility. I've always loved taking walks around those parts. The gentle rustle of the wind through the shivering reeds and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet seemed to wash away the stress of the daily commute to work. It almost seemed like it existed separately from the rest of the world, my own private dimension. It had been raining heavily that summer, and I found myself aching to get back to my daily routine. My dog, Bailey, had been just as eager, scratching and whining at the front door. Being a border collie, she lived to roam the open green, which made her a perfect companion for me. On the first clear day, we had both left that morning without a single hesitation. The scent of wet leaves on the misting air filled my nostrils. Bailey pushed on ahead, her tongue lolled out and happily panting. I had to jog just to keep up with her as she tugged at a leash. We had taken our usual route around the lake, through the bog, half hidden by reeds. Flies buzzed lazily over our heads under the warming sun, casting stretching shadows of the thin trees that plotted the ground. Moss clung to their dark brown trunks, climbing toward their branches. The squelching ground beneath us half soaked into my shoes, but I didn't care. I just felt so alive. A low rustle through the thicket made Bailey go rigid in her step, ears pricking upward as she caught the scent of something, probably a rabbit. She turned to me, her big brown eyes wide and pleading. I laughed. "Okay, girl," I told her, clipping off her leash. "Go right on ahead." She disappeared as a black and white blur through the surrounding grasses. The white tip of her tail sticking upwards was the only sign of her for the next few minutes, until it too was swallowed up into the towering green, leaving only some rustles, splashes, and the occasional bark. I stood there, watching and arching my back towards the warm sunlight that streaked through the disappearing grey clouds. It felt like forever since I had felt it on my skin. It had been a few minutes of complete relaxation when I noticed the silence. It was something I had long become used to, but this one was different. There were no birds chirping in the trees or patter of rabbits' feet. Bailey's bark seemed to have been swallowed up by it. "Bailey," I called out, my heart already pounded with anxiety. Nothing. "Here, girl," I whistled. Still nothing. My stomach knotted. Bailey was my best friend. I had her for 3 years. I loved her. Even just the thought that something might have happened to her was like a knife twisting into me. I rushed forwards, peeling back the plants and calling her name. A low rustle silenced the growing worry inside of me. My heart leapt. "God, you really scared me there." As my eyes adjusted to the small form paddling through the shallow end of the lake, the thought rooted me to the spot. It wasn't Bailey. I had no idea what it was. Its small, pale form skimmed effortlessly through the water, barely making a ripple. The assumption that it was a fish was thrown out when it hoisted itself onto the dry banks, shaking itself dry. Its skin was neither scaly nor covered in fur. Instead, a thick, sickly grey that bulged out with warts, not unlike a toad. Its body shone slick with water in the overhead sunlight. Its massive head that bobbed down as it dragged itself around on its tiny limbs. A careless stumble alerted it to my presence. It turned around, and the breath froze inside my body. Pure black stared back at me. There was no iris or sclera to be seen. Its eyes were huge, taking up almost 2/3 of its skull and almost devoid of light. Underneath were 2 tiny holes and a thin, almost invisible line that composed the mouth and nose. In all my time living here, I'd become acquainted to the local wildlife: birds, frogs, badgers, voles, and even the occasional deer. But it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Yet, there was something unnervingly familiar about it. It looked like a baby. I remembered the vague, dusty science lessons when my class had been shown one developing, amidst barely muffled giggles and whispers. Aside from the obvious inhuman features, it was almost identical. The oversized head, the big eyes, and the underdeveloped limbs. It blinked, straining its neck under the weight of its bulbous skull to look up at me, its mouth expanding into a toothless, gaping grin, cooing as it crawled over. I just stood there, my rational mind trying to process the abnormal sight in front of me, if it was even real. I jolted as I felt a sudden pressure on the toe of my shoe. I looked down to see the creature chewing on it, a pearly string of drool slicking the mud-encrusted leather. The creature gaped up with another vacant smile. If it hadn't been for those pitch-black, soulless eyes that seemed to be trained on my slightest breath, I would have called it cute. As grotesque as it was, I felt a sudden compulsion to pick it up and rock it in my arms. I didn't know if it was centuries of human instinct encoded in me or just pity for how misshapen it was. But every cell in my body seemed to be pushing for it, despite the fear wavering through my body. There was more rustling coming from a patch of dense reeds close to where the creature and I was. I saw a flash of peeking black before 2 more tiny heads poked through. Another submerged up from the still surface of the lake. Soon, it had been joined by 5 more identical creatures. They stared up curiously at my new, alien presence, though, unlike the bolder one, they seemed to be keeping their distance, half hidden in the bogland, emitting high-pitched chirps and gurgles. Bailey had been pushed to the back of my mind, though ever present. I craned around the tiny thing, trying my best not to step on it as my eyes scanned for any distinctive movement amongst the plants. I wondered whether she had encountered one and chased it off into the distance, thinking it was a rabbit. Looking down at their stubby appendages, I doubted any of them would get very far. I winced at the thought, hoping that she hadn't killed one of them. Bailey didn't have a bad bone in her body, but she never realized her own strength, especially when it came to things smaller than her. I sucked in a breath, fingers clenching at my sides. Lifting my foot slightly, I managed to slide the creature off without harming it and knelt beside it until its head was just inches away from mine. Without even understanding what I was doing, my hands were already around its sides, hoisting it into the air. It kicked its chubby legs in glee at the sudden contact, tiny hands pawing at the air, trying to reach my face. Its squealing rose to a near inaudible pitch, wearing a wide smile. I soon found myself forgetting my fear, lulled by the soft sounds it was making, and found myself smiling at its antics. It looked at me as if I was the most amazing thing it had ever seen in its life, the same way Bailey always did. It possessed that unconditional adoration that only children and animals are capable of. It needed me. The moment was so consuming, that I barely even registered something floating across the water. I found myself prepared to dismiss it as a lily pad until I looked closer. I only saw the bloody scraps of black fur when it was already too late. As my head turned back to the thing in my hands, I saw sharpened teeth slide out from under the shadow of its pale pink gums, where there had been none just minutes before, almost too big for its mouth, with the tattered remains of a dog collar stuck to them. Its body began to vibrate, jaws snapping. I found myself barely able to hold it back, regardless of being several times bigger than it. The sweet coos and gurgles it had been making morphed into hungry snarls and hisses. I hurled it to the ground. It bounced off the stones, lying still for a few minutes. I was sure that I had killed it until it pushed itself off the ground, dazed. Those same eyes turned towards me, glassy with tears. Its bottom lip quivered. It threw its head back with a pitiful wail. Any thought of escape or even retaliation for what it had done to Bailey instantly evaporated in my head as the sound rang through my ears. The cry of a newborn baby. My leg muscles pushed myself towards it, despite the screaming protests of my mind, my hands already reaching out to it. A scream tore itself from my throat, sent a flock of birds resting in a nearby tree scattering as I felt miniature bladed teeth embed itself into my calf, tiny fingers bruising my skin. They swarmed around my feet like a shoal of tiny humanoid piranha, clambering up my ankles towards my knees, trying to pull me to the ground. My hands helplessly groped towards the sky, my legs encased by slithering bodies. God, they were all laughing too. Scratchy, distorted imitations of real babies as they had me surrounded. My mind was a blur of panic. I would die here. They would rip me apart into nothing, just like they had done to my best friend. Memories of Bailey flashed through my mind in quick succession. Her warm, wet nose, her soft fur beneath my fingers, the clack of her paws down the wooden hallway. All the things I loved about her that I knew I would never experience again. Rage bubbled upwards in me, spilling over. With one swift, adrenaline-fueled kick, I managed to send two flying back into the lake. Another skull fractured beneath my heel, soft brains spilling onto the ground. I broke into a stumbling run, pain rushing up from the open wound already soaking through the leg of my jeans. But I refused to stop or look back, their shrieks spilling into my ears. I didn't know how far I had run before I finally crumpled into a ditch. The blue denim of my jeans was soaked maroon from the gaping wound they had left behind. My eyes remained frozen to the gravel, too afraid to look up in case I saw them crawling towards me. When I raised my head, only to see the empty road, I fell over and wept. It's been a year now since that day. I don't go walking anymore, at least not down that path. The scar still runs over my leg, a good 2 inches in length. Though it's faded with time, the memories haven't. There hasn't been a day where Bailey hasn't occupied my mind. Her food bowl still sits in the corner of my kitchen, gathering dust. Her leash strung up over the upstairs landing, and her toys are still scattered around, ready to be played with. I didn't have the heart to get rid of them. Some days I just sit on the edge of my bed and look at them. No matter how hard I try, my thoughts always settle back to 2 painful words. If only. If only I hadn't chosen to walk around that lake. If only I hadn't let Bailey off a leash. If only we'd left when I heard the unearthly silence. Nevertheless, I tried to think of the good times we shared, to keep her memory alive. No one goes near the lake anymore. Animals have gone missing down there. A few people too. The police have searched for them, but always come up empty-handed. It's the kind of place where no one really knows how many have disappeared down there. But I know exactly where they are. I've already put the house up on the market. I'm still waiting on a buyer, but I just want to get out of this place as quickly as possible. Never did I think that I would ever want to leave this place. But here I am. Sometimes when it's dark, I can hear scuffling on my front porch. There are mornings where I find half-eaten animal parts roped around the grass. The crying of a baby seeps into my dreams with hellish shrieks, growls and whispers. Bared teeth flash out through the darkness of my mind, along with the flashing reflection of huge, shark black eyes and rippling waters encircling me, ready to descend and rip apart my flesh. There's no relief from it, not even when I wake up. Especially when I see the dozens of tiny red handprints smeared along the edges of my bedroom window.